Sir Robert Cargrave? He asked, but he spoke with difficulty certain sounds, such as the B in Robert and the V in Cargrave, being almost impossible for him to utter. To shape these sounds, the lips must be used, and the gentleman before me was the victim of some terrible affliction that had caused his lips to be pulled perpetually apart from each other, baring his teeth in a continuous, ghastly smile. It was the same mirthless grin I had seen once before, on the face of a person in the last throes of lockjaw. We physicians have a name for that chilling grimace, a Latin name, and as it entered my mind, it seemed to dispel yet another mystery, for the term we use to describe the lockjaw smile is risus sardonicus. A pallor approaching phosphorescence completed his astonishing appearance. That creepy guy can be found in this book. Here he is here. He can be found in this book. This is Haunted Castles, the complete Gothic stories of Ray Russell. Welcome, my friends, welcome to stately Vaughan Manor. And it's Sunday, so you know it's the Sunday Penguin today. And this is an odd Sunday Penguin. It's a little on the weird side. It's this one, Ray Russell's Haunted Castles. Now, this is published in the Penguin horror line. This particular hardcover, these cool old hardcovers. Well, they're not that old. They're only from, 7 years ago? Something like that. But this actually is now available, this volume is now available as a standard black spine classic from Penguin. Excellent book. So, as I'm recording this, the second week of Horror Mayhem has come to an end. The second week of Horror Mayhem, and Horror Mayhem is a reading event created by the Bookish Bryants to get us all to read more horror, which is always a good idea. So the second week of Horror Mayhem is all about Gothic horror. And one of the things I read for the second week, and probably the best thing I read for the second week, is this, Haunted Castles, the complete Gothic stories by Ray Russell. This is really an interesting book, and it's a lot of fun, this book. These Gothic horror stories by Ray Russell. Ray Russell was an interesting fellow. For a long time, he was the fiction editor at Playboy magazine, and he published a lot of stories by Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson and guys like that. And he was a writer himself who liked that kind of thing. And so he wrote a good deal of horror and supernatural fiction. And this particular volume is really interesting because he did write this series of Gothic horror stories. And they kind of have the feel, the stories themselves kind of have the feel of some of those classic old horror stories from decades before he was writing. But they also have their share of deviant sexuality. All over these stories. These stories are covered in deviant sexuality, just so you know. I know, it makes them extra fun. So these stories have their fair share of that going on, which sets them apart from the more classic horror stories of old. But they do have that kind of feel and that kind of structure. The stories included in this volume, the one I was just reading from was the first story in my personal favorite, actually, which was Sardonicus. There's a trilogy of stories in here. Sardonicus, Sagittarius, and Sanguinarius. Sanguinarius, that's another really good one. Also included in this volume are the stories Comet Wine, The Runaway Lovers, The Vendetta, and The Cage. The first three stories in this volume, the initial trilogy of stories, are the best, I think, by a long shot. But they're all good. They're all a lot of fun. They are all worth reading. They all have a tremendous sense of atmosphere. That great crumbling Gothic atmosphere, as in the first story of Sardonicus. This poor fella, Mr. Sardonicus, he would be a poor fella if he wasn't such a ghastly person. And boy, is he ghastly. So, in the initial story, Dr. Cargrave gets a letter from a woman he knew years and years ago, and, you know, he kind of liked this lady. But she was from a rich family. They lost their money, and she ended up marrying this Italian guy. And he suddenly gets a letter from her to go, you know, why don't you come and visit us at our crumbling Gothic castle? So he does. He goes and visits them at their crumbling Gothic castle and gets himself involved in a situation that's more than a little bit creepy, because this guy, the ghastly Sardonicus, has called him there for a very specific purpose. And if he doesn't do what this guy wants him to do, oh, the consequences will be. Well, they're not good, guys. I'm telling you that. So that's just the first story. All the stories have that crumbling, atmospheric, Gothic horror in these stories, and they're all just so entertaining. I really enjoyed this. It was actually, if you're going to read stories for a Gothic week in Horror Mayhem, this was actually the perfect choice. These are really good examples of the Gothic in horror. And so perfect for Gothic horror stories. And as horrors, just as horror stories themselves, they're really good. These are some really good stories. They're a little on the simple side as far as the plots. The plots are very direct, and they are reminiscent of some of the pulpier, well, in more ways than one, they're reminiscent of the pulpier stories. But one of the good things you get from pulp is a directness of plot. They don't mess around, these stories. They get right to the point. And he does. But he doesn't sacrifice any of that atmosphere that I was talking about. And they are, you know, really well written. This guy, Ray Russell, was a pretty good writer. So it's all the more sad that so many of his books are so hard to find now. Penguin has rescued a couple. Penguin has rescued this one, the Gothic stories. And they've also published The Case Against Satan, his novel, The Case Against Satan. They've published that as a Penguin classic. But he wrote a lot more than that, and a lot of those, to find them, you're going to have to jump on eBay probably, because they've been out of print for years and years. And as I was looking into this guy, I was seeing some of the other stuff he wrote, and a lot of it looks pretty trashy, actually. Which doesn't surprise me. These stories do have a trashy element to them, but they're just so darn good. And so he kind of stands in that borderline between classic horror and trashy horror. I guess the classic horror won because he's in the Penguin classics, and these stories at least. But that makes him an interesting writer. It also is interesting that he's just so little spoken about. You don't hear much about this guy. I don't think I've ever read any of these stories in this volume before I read this. That seems impossible. I feel like I must have read these stories before. But as I was reading them, no, I don't think I have, because I don't remember this stuff. And you would think I would, because these are some pretty memorable stories, let me tell you. He was good with plots, and he always had that twist that he threw in there. He always threw in a twist or two, this guy, Ray Russell. So they're really interesting stories, and they're very much well worth reading. I am very glad that Penguin Classics did publish this. Like I said, now available as a Black Spine Classic that you can go out and get. This is the old Penguin Horror line, which is... You can still find them. You can still get these guys. But the Black Spine Classic version of this is probably easier to find. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about this particular book at this particular time. It was pretty cool though. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.